Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the P.A.D webinar series. Tonight's topic is Veterans Law, presented by Jenny Tang. Jenny is an appellate litigation attorney at Bergman and Moore in the Washington, D.C. area. She represents veterans and their families against the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, which is CVC. Jenny previously worked for nearly 5 years at the Board of Veterans Appeals. She received her B.A. in English Literature and Sociology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and her J.D. in 2012 from the University of Tennessee College of Law. She is the proud daughter, sister, granddaughter-in-law of Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans and servicemen. Jenny is also an alum of Phi Alpha Delta Sanford chapter, and she previously served for 3 years as District 23 Justice, overseeing 11 chapters in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. She is currently a member of the Robert E. Redding National Capital Area Alumni Chapter. If you have questions during the presentation, please use a chat feature, and we will address those questions during the question and answer period at the end of the session. Also, if you have any ideas of topics for the P.A.D webinar series, please email the executive office at info@pad.org, and Jenny will be sharing her information at the end of the presentation. Also, as with all of Zoom world right now, we have to deal with power outages, internet connections, and everything that is the world at the moment. So please be patient as we work through those issues. There's a storm going through DC, Baltimore area, which affects both Jenny and I, but we will do our best. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the P.A.D YouTube channel, hopefully tomorrow, if not the next day. And for right now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jenny Tang. Jenny, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction, and thank you, Phi Alpha Delta, for having me tonight. I'm so pleased to present about veterans law at this webinar. I'll just go right into it. All right, that's my bio. Nobody wants to see that again. All right, just a quick overview of VA benefits. So Congress has established many different types of benefits for veterans and their families pursuant to statute, as well as the general process by which claims are adjudicated. And the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs have implemented regulations for how claims and appeals are processed as well. There are many, many different types of VA benefits available for veterans and their survivors. Here are some examples, but there are many, many more. But the types of claims that practitioners deal with the most are for compensation and pension. And the basic authorities that control these different types of claims are located at Title 38 of the U.S. Code, Title 38 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and precedent from the federal courts, including the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims and the higher courts. And before I get into the different types of jobs and the different sectors of practice, I will say that in any job within veterans law, and really within any legal job, it's about issue spotting. And so you're going to be looking at a claims folder that has many times thousands and thousands of pages of records, including service treatment records and service personnel records from the DoD, medical evidence, including VA examinations, and many years of post-service treatment records and many lay statements as well. And typically, I would say an average case includes about 4,000 pages of documents. It is a very complex area of law, even though the common law is fairly new. And it can get very confusing very fast because of the complexity of the law and the complexity of many of the medical questions at issue. So it's hard work. It's definitely not for the lazy lawyer, but it is worth it. It is definitely worth it to be able to help your veteran clients navigate through this complex system. I will say my very first My very first brief that I filed with the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, the case ended up being remanded back to the board, and the board granted that man's claim. This was a wonderful case because this was a combat veteran who had been decorated for valor in the Vietnam War. And he had been fighting VA since the early 2000s. He had very, very severe PTSD that he was fighting for higher benefits. And because he won that claim, he ended up with a retroactive payment of over $500,000, as well as a monthly payment going forward that was more than enough for him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. And that was just an incredible, incredible case for me. And it just really kind of took off from there. And before I get into the points where attorneys come in, I'll go a little bit into the claims process itself. The VA claims process was meant to be non-adversarial and veteran friendly. So when you are a representative of a veteran or a widow, you are not opposing any party. It's non-adversarial. And typically these are initiated where the veteran files a claim for benefits for disability with the VA regional office, many times with the help free of charge from a veterans service organization such as the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, Vietnam Veterans of America, those types of organizations that help veterans for free initiate their claims. And typically the veteran will file a claim for service connection for a disability that he has. So what he's asking VA to do is to recognize that his disability is related to his service. Very, very, very basically, the basic elements of service connection are: 1, a current disability; 2, an in-service event, disease, or injury; and 3, a connection or a nexus between those two. And if the regional office does end up granting him entitlement to service connection for that disability, he then can receive free or discounted VA treatment and monthly compensation that is based on the severity of his service-connected disability. And at any point, a veteran can also claim for an increase in his compensation. For example, if his disability gets worse over time, even if it's just due to aging, or if he can't work anymore because of his service-connected disability, he can file for an increase. And VA's 38 CFR Part 4, those regulations determine the disability ratings that are assigned for each disability. And these are assigned percentages going up to 100%, because a person can only be a 100% person. But there are also other available benefits over and above the monthly percentage rating that he could possibly get for his disability. For very, very severely disabled veterans, there are also grants available for things like housing and adapted auto equipment. So things like ramps installed in the house for folks in wheelchairs, or cars that can lift scooters or wheelchairs into the trunk electronically, or cars that allow a veteran to drive when he has lost the use of his legs. So there are a lot of different available benefits available. And when a veteran dies, his survivor, such as his widow, can file for a claim for survivor benefits, such as dependency and indemnity compensation, which is a monthly benefit, or burial benefits. Now, say the veteran files a claim, but the regional office denies the full benefits he or she is seeking. I'm going to get into the VA appeals process now, and where attorneys fit in at each point in the process going forward. So when the veteran receives an unfavorable decision from the VA regional office, he might retain an attorney at this point. Private attorneys who are hired to represent the veteran are paid on contingency, which means they get a percentage of any benefits that he wins. He could also seek representation from nonprofit organizations, or he could seek pro bono representation, which means that the attorney is representing him for free. Now, if the veteran chooses to appeal or to challenge the regional office decision, before February 2019, the appeals process was linear in theory. And after February 2019, the veteran now has 3 appeal lanes to choose from. I'll get more into that a little bit in a second. If he appeals all the way up, the final appellate decision maker within VA is the Board of Veterans Appeals. And there, they essentially practice administrative law. So they are applying the controlling authorities, regulations, and statutes, and making a decision on the veteran's claim on appeal. So attorneys at the Board of Veterans Appeals will draft the decision, make a decision on the claim, and the veteran's law judge will check that decision for legal and factual accuracy, and the veteran's law judge will sign the decision. The Board of Veterans Appeals has something like 1,000 employees and about 100 veterans law judges, and they issue something like 90,000 board decisions a year. So there's plenty of work. The exact numbers can be found on the board's website in their annual reports. So I mentioned before that when a veteran appeals a decision that happened before February 2019, in theory, the appeals process was supposed to be linear. This is a graphical representation of what it was supposed to work like in theory. But really, in practice, the VA appeals process became very complex very quickly, and the process became untenable, as you can see in this graphic here. So in February 2019, they implemented a law passed by Congress called the Veterans Appeals Modernization and Improvement Act, which now allows for 3 lanes to choose from to appeal an unfavorable regional office decision. And as you can see on the right, the 3rd lane is an appeal of the decision directly to the Board of Veterans Appeals to get a decision from the veterans law judge. So going a little bit into the basics of the judicial review process. So say the veteran receives an unfavorable decision from the Board of Veterans Appeals. And like I stated before, that is the final appellate decision maker within the Department of Veteran Affairs. So if the veteran chooses to appeal the board decision, he can do so to the U.S. Court of Appeals for veterans claims. And this is the federal court with exclusive jurisdiction over VA appeals. Congress actually created the court in 1988, and the court issued its first precedential decision in 1990. So compared to contract law or property law or tort law, which has had hundreds of years of developing common law, veterans law has a relatively small body of common law, and it is constantly changing and developing because there are so many different areas and legal issues that still need clarification and development. Now, if you end up in practice before the court, note that it is an adversarial process. So before, within VA, it's non-adversarial, but now before the federal judicial court system, it is an adversarial process where appellants or the veteran retains counsel, such as a private attorney who is paid through the Equal Access to Justice Act if he or she is successful. So here it's not by contingency. Here, if the case is successful before the court, the attorney is paid at an hourly rate that is separate from any pot of money that the veteran may receive in the future if he wins his claim. The veteran can also get representation from various nonprofit organizations or pro bono representation. And the opposing party is the VA secretary himself. And he is represented by appellate attorneys within the VA Office of General Counsel. And that's a picture of the CAVC's courtroom itself. So a little bit about the court's process. First, the court has this process called the Rule 33 process. It's an informal negotiation, essentially, and it allows the VA attorney to admit to legal mistakes early on so as to mitigate the number of cases that end up in chambers. And this has been a very successful process so far in the court's 30-year history. The court hires central legal staff attorneys, or CLS attorneys, who handle ruling on motions as well as mediating phone conferences between the parties' counsel. And the parties try to reach an agreement, but if they don't, then we proceed with the appellate briefing process, which for those of you who are in law school, it's just like filing appellate briefs like you've learned how to do, and filing reply briefs as well. The court actually has the authority to issue non-precedential single judge decisions, which means they are deciding the appeal for that one veteran, but their ruling is not going to bind any other veterans' cases. The court also has the authority to issue precedential decisions, of course, and those can be issued from a panel of 3 judges or en banc, which means the entire bench. Currently, there are 7 judges on the bench and 2 openings, so the court would be full if it had 9 judges. And each judge hires multiple judicial clerks to fill their chambers. The fun thing about the court and practicing before the court is that the court is issuing more and more precedential decisions every year, which translates to more and more opportunities for oral argument and more opportunities to create law, even if you are a junior associate. So you could be in your first year in practice and you could end up with a case that if you win, you not only help your client's life, but you can also impact the lives of thousands of veterans going forward because you have essentially created new law. And this happens more often than you would think. That makes it very, very exciting. It also means that the common law in this field is constantly developing and changing. So you do have to be flexible and you do have to stay up to date on all the new cases that keep coming out. Sometimes, you know, multiple cases in 1 week. And fun fact, very recently the court has implemented new class action rules, which means that now folks can file class actions with this court. So if you need to appeal an unfavorable decision from the CAVC, you can do so with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, although they do have limited jurisdiction. And if you get an unfavorable decision from the Federal Circuit, you can appeal that to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court has issued 5 major veterans law cases, including the recent Gray v. Wilkie case, which established a multi-factor standard for when a court should afford an agency deference in its decision-making. In other words, this one veteran's case, this one Navy veteran from the Vietnam era, he took his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and his case ended up changing the entire landscape of administrative law and how the judiciary affords deference to agencies when they make decisions. And that's not just VA, but also agencies like the DoD and other federal agencies. So that is amazing. And the U.S. Supreme Court is it has expressed that it is becoming more and more interested in veterans law cases. So we're going to see more, I think, from the U.S. Supreme Court. I just threw this picture in there. It was a fun program that I hosted at the U.S. Supreme Court on U.S. Supreme Court cases at the Supreme Court. And we were very honored to hear from Justice Breyer, who was an early proponent of the creation of the court, and including the creation of the court as an Article I court. So before the creation of the court in 1988, Board of Veterans Appeals decisions were not reviewed by any judicial body. So VA existed in a, quote, splendid isolation, and none of their decisions were reviewed for legal and factual accuracy, which is why policymakers decided to create the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims in 1988. So if you're still in law school, you can practice veterans law at your law school clinic if you've got one. There are more and more veterans law clinics popping up all over the country. Or you could participate in the National Veterans Law Moot Court Competition. The next one is coming up here in the fall, and they are currently working on organizing the events, even with COVID. I believe they're thinking about a virtual type of format as well, but that's up to the court to organize. If you want more information about the Moot Court Competition, you could Google it, and the George Washington Law School website should show information about it, as they are co-sponsors of the competition. And this is a very cool competition because, at least before COVID, the semifinalists and the finalists got to actually travel to DC and present their oral arguments in the courtroom itself before the federal judges, which is very, very cool. So here are some tips and resources if you're just starting out or interested in breaking into a career in veterans law. So overall, I will say this is a niche field in a pretty small legal community. So beyond the basics, which I've presented here, I would suggest that you talk to people and you network with folks already in the field, because that should help you find opportunities. I will also note that this is a uniquely collegial bar. So even though the attorneys in this field may be opposing parties or on opposing sides many of the times, we are all connected by our shared interest in ensuring the best service is provided to veterans and their families. And the court itself also emphasizes the uniquely collegial nature of this practice. So there are some organizations that hire attorneys, including attorneys straight out of law school. I've mentioned some of these before already. Starting with the Board of Veterans Appeals, they, as my understanding is, they have all of their openings posted on usajobs.gov. And they have openings for attorneys and for clerkships, which they recently restarted that program. Now, this is a great place to start if you're interested in veterans law and if you're straight out of law school as well, because it gives you a foundation of knowledge at a relatively relaxed pace. The Board of Veterans Appeals has a robust training program, and they don't give you a full caseload right away. So they're giving you time to really learn the law, and for folks like me and most of the people who enter in this field who have no prior experience or knowledge at all about veterans law. I didn't even take admin law in law school. This particular place where I started was a great opportunity for me to really learn. And I say it is a relatively relaxed pace because compared to appellate litigation, it is relaxed. Appellate litigation, as many of you know, is pretty frenetic. There are constantly changing deadlines, and very quickly you end up with a high caseload. So the learning curve is already steep, but I believe it is steeper if you jump right into appellate litigation. So The Board of Veterans Appeals, I don't believe have any openings right now. I checked this morning on usajobs.gov, but they are currently hiring large numbers of attorneys. Since 2013, they have hired hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new attorneys. The board has, I believe, doubled in size, if not more. So I would suggest that you set up an alert in your usajobs.gov account to hear from the board as to any openings. Also, just a couple quick pro tips for getting past the USA Jobs screening processes. These are screenings that are done either by the computer or by just some HR representative who doesn't know the nature of the job and isn't a lawyer themselves. You will see an announcement on usajobs.gov that they've got all of these, skills that are required. Now, those are buzzwords that you should try to incorporate to the extent you can into your application, such as your resume or your cover letter. Because what happens is these HR folks literally just go down the checklist to see whether or not you meet those skills, or at least transferable skills, but you want to make sure you make it easy for them. Additionally, usajobs.gov asks you all these questions, like on a scale of like 0 to 10. Do you consider yourself an expert at, say, interpretation of regulations or writing legal work product? Now, don't sell yourself short there, because you are not comparing yourself to other attorneys. You are comparing yourself to the entire population of the workforce. So when you look at your neighbor and compare yourself to your neighbor, you are indeed 10 out of 10 an expert in interpreting the law, even if you are straight out of law school. So that should help you get past the first screening on usajobs.gov. And of course, if you've got veteran status, or if you are a spouse of a veteran, I believe you also have preference. The Office of General Counsel Appellate Group also offers litigation jobs and internships. Their litigation jobs, I believe, are through usajobs.gov, and I believe that they finished their last big hiring push, but they're growing and growing as well. So I would also add an alert in your USA Jobs account for their office. Their internships are a new program that they established, and those summer internships are pretty much by word of mouth. So whenever I hear about these opportunities, I post them on the P.A.D Facebook page, and I will continue to do so. And of course, there are private firms, and these practice before VA and or the court. My firm, Bergman & Moore, which I believe is the largest veterans law firm in the country, has a section that practices only before VA and a section that practices only before the court. That section in which I work in, we are hiring at this time. And so as I promised on the announcement, I'll let you know how to apply. We are hiring Rule 10 attorneys and appellate litigation attorneys at this time on a rolling basis, and I believe they're going to try and complete their interviews by video and their writing assessments by the end of July, so that we can have folks onboarded by August. Rule 10 attorneys are kind of like document review attorneys, in that you are looking through all of the documents, looking for certain issues. And that is a good stepping stone to getting a job as an appellate litigation attorney, because it makes you familiar with the record and the types of documents and the types of legal and medical issues you might end up litigating. For appellate litigation attorneys, we at Bergman & Moore are looking for folks with strong law school performance. If you're interested in applying, I'm happy to forward your resume to the folks at Bergman & Moore for them to take a look at and initiate that process. And at the end of this presentation, I've added my email. So there are other private firms all over the country as well. There's another one, Chisholm and Kilpatrick. They're out in Rhode Island, and there are firms and organizations all over the country. The other way you could try and get into the field is by joining a nonprofit organization, and there are nonprofit organizations around the country, but the big one is the National Veterans Legal Services Program. And if you look on their website, you can see if they have any opportunities for hiring. I checked this morning, it didn't look like they were hiring, but very recently I know they had an opening up, so keep checking their website. There are also there are also judicial clerkship opportunities. As I've said, each judge has their own chambers and they fill it with judicial clerks. A year or two ago, the court was using that online application system for judicial clerkships, and I heard that it was a nightmare. So I don't know if they've stopped using that altogether or what, because the last 2 openings for clerkships were directly on the court's website. They don't have any openings right now, but as I've said, there are 2 openings on the bench. And once those 2 new judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, they will also fill their chambers with new judicial clerks. Also, don't forget about policy opportunities. There are veteran service organizations that hire staff to lobby for policy and legislation on the Hill. And those service organizations, like I said, are like the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, et cetera, et cetera. And there are also opportunities on the Hill itself. So say you want to get into policy work for veterans, you could try and join either the House or the Senate Veterans Affairs Committees, either for the minority party or the majority party. And for those of you who are interested in pro bono practice, I highly recommend that you sign up and check out the Veterans Consortium Pro Bono program. They are extremely effective and a very well-run organization, and they connect pro bono attorneys with clients from all over the country, including many attorneys from big law firms all over the country. So if you want to get involved, you can do so right away. You can join the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Bar Association. We do have a free trial membership, and we provide continuing legal education programs, other educational programs, networking, veteran-centric community service, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the organization that I am currently the president for, which is why I've done this blatant plug. You could also think about publishing in a law review, such as the Veterans Law Review. Law reviews across the country are becoming more and more interested in publishing veterans law articles, so keep that in mind. And there are also non-peer-reviewed publication opportunities, such as the Veterans Law Journal, which the Bar Association publishes. You could also get involved with the CAVC Historical Society. Or if you are starting out and you're more interested in practice just within the agency, or if you're just starting out creating your own firm, the National Organization of Veterans Advocates is a great organization. It's huge. It's run by really amazing people, and they provide tips and resources for folks who are just starting out, as well as, you know, folks who are creating their own firms. So here are some practitioner resources for those who are starting out. The first 2 are just helpful. So the Veterans Benefits Administration, or VBA, they have this adjudication manual online, and they have this online because their regional office adjudicators are not lawyers, so they need guidelines and help for processing, you know, millions and millions of claims every year. And when you go to this link, you'll see that it is just as effective as a Google search, which is wonderful. So you can just type in some keywords and the adjudication manual will just pop up some answers for you. Now keep in mind that this adjudication manual is not binding law. So I wouldn't cite to it if you've got other citations available that are precedent. But it is a very helpful resource. There are other resources on the VA website that I've added here. But the resource that I most highly recommend is NVLSP's Veterans Benefits Manual, which you can buy at this link. It's pricey, but I think it's worth it. This giant manual, so the first half of the manual provides as comprehensive an overview of veterans law as one can put in a book. It is excellent. It gives you the case law, the statutes, the regulations. It gives you tips and tricks on analyzing these different types of issues. It's great. And then the second half of the book gives you tips and tricks on how to practice before the court. So they give you all the common types of legal mistakes that the Board of Veterans Appeals makes. It gives you tips on how to challenge the board's decision, as well as case law and other authorities to support your arguments. So when I first transitioned to appellate litigation, my go-to was this Veterans Benefits Manual, so I highly recommend it. Well, that does it for me. I can open it up to questions at this time. I can't see the questions, and I believe Andrew or another administrator was gonna tell me them verbally.
Jenny, you have a lot of questions.
Oh, do I? Okay. Well, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Sure. We have almost 20 questions, and so what I'll be doing is sending Jenny the questions via email, and then we will send the answers back out because we can only get to a few of them in the time allotted. The first one we'll get to is from Robert, and he asks, is there a specific area or specific course we should focus on in law school for people who want to become and represent veterans?
So I would say administrative law. And if you have a veterans law course at your school, of course, I would recommend that. But honestly, 90%, if not more, of the folks who end up in this field had 0 classes that were relevant to veterans law. In fact, the rules of evidence don't really even apply to practice before the federal appellate courts. So I'll be honest, I didn't even take evidence in law school. I just learned it for the bar exam, and I've never used evidence in my practice. So that's my answer. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Serena asked a question, and have they changed any of their positions on Parkinson's in relation to Agent Orange or TCE?
So the presumptions for service connection, which means that here Congress has looked at a bunch of medical studies, and those medical studies say that there is a definitive relationship between certain disabilities and exposure to tactical herbicides such as Agent Orange in Vietnam and limitedly in other areas. So there have been no new developments in that field. The same presumptions still apply for the same disabilities that were, given the presumption. The big difference recently in this particular area is that now under Procopio and under the new Blue Water Navy Act, they are now extending the presumption to Navy veterans who had certain types of blue water service. So they served on ships that were within the territorial waters of Vietnam. So that is the biggest, most recent change.
Excellent. Renee asks, how does the status of discharge impact the available benefits? For example, dishonorable discharge.
That's a really good question. So if you have an other than honorable discharge, such as a dishonorable discharge, then you do not have veteran status in the eyes of VA. But that is a type of legal issue that can be litigated and that you can challenge within VA. So even if you had a dishonorable discharge, there are some ways to show VA that the reasons for your discharge were due to a disability incurred in service, including such as psychiatric disabilities or psychosis. those are very difficult to argue, but I have worked on cases where we successfully argued for veteran status, even with a bad paper discharge.
Excellent. We do have a question from Andrea. Would veterans law be an area that employment attorneys could explore, or are they entirely separate entities?
So I myself have never practiced in employment law, and I don't recall very much, if any, overlap in the controlling authorities. Veterans law is a pretty contained area of law, and the doctrine can pretty much be put into 2 big volumes. But I do think that being an employment attorney gives you a lot of transferable skills, including the ability to sift through lots and lots of documents, including medical documents, and being able to pick out issues in that way.
Okay, we have one more question, and then for everyone that asks another question, we'll get Jenny to answer those via email, and we'll send those out to you. From Kathy, she asks, when representing our veterans, what are the bar licensing requirements? The cases start as administrative law in federal courts, so do you have to be barred in the state where the veteran lives?
The answer is no. So as long as you are barred and in good standing with any state, then you can end up getting certified as an authorized attorney or an accredited attorney with VA if you want to practice just before VA. And if you want to practice before the court, then you can get barred with the court by showing that you are in good standing with a state bar. In addition, it would be impossible to be barred in the state where your clients are living, because we've got clients from all around the world.
All right, well, I really appreciate everyone's participation tonight, and Jenny, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in this field in veterans law. Like I said, we will be uploading the PowerPoint presentation to the P.A.D website. We'll send a link out to you so you can all get those links that Jenny shared with us. And we will be producing this video for our P.A.D YouTube channel. And again, if you have any ideas for future webinars, please let us know at the executive office at info@pad.org, or you can email me directly at andrew@pad.org. And thank you so much again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good night.